Good morning. Well, I have to say that after 25 years in the industry, I've always found railways really exciting, and there's nothing more exciting than thinking about tomorrow's railway. So what I aim to do in the next 15 minutes or so is to give you a perspective of tomorrow's railway from the perspective of the Railway Supply Group. So I'll explain to you what the Railway Supply Group is, what it's about, and how it has relevance and value in our title today, Tomorrow's Railway. I'm also going to explain to you what your role is in the Railway Supply Group, because in effect, we are all members of it. Now, you may ask yourself, in the context of the presentation that we've just had from Mark and the warm-up from Pete and Kirsty, is it right that a really important part of developing tomorrow's railway is yet another railway group? Another opportunity for us to get together and have conversations with one another. Fantastic. Well, that's got to be the right solution, hasn't it? And you can understand my scepticism when I thought that might be the case as well. But Railway Supply Group is a little bit different, I venture, not least because it's actually chaired by two Secretary of States, the Secretary of State for Business, Innovation and Skills, and the Secretary of State for Transport. So actually the context in which Railway Supply Group meets is rather different from some of the other things that may be associated with talking shops. What I'll do in this presentation is just try and give you a perspective of how RSG can work with its members to transform the railway we have today into the one we want to have tomorrow. I don't think anyone here is arguing that the status quo is where we want to be. So let's just step back a second, and I should count, it's really important that you see my comments today in the context of Railway Supply Group, rather than perhaps South West Trains or Network Rail or Stagecoach or any other organisation like that. And I'm going to talk from, I hope, a railway-wide perspective rather than purely from one aspect of it. Because ultimately, we are all in some way or the other part of the railway supply community and part of the railway industry. Now, we've heard an awful lot about the state of the railway today, and you just can't escape hearing from the state of the railway today. Whilst eating my cornflakes this morning, in the Times, fully written up, there's a big thing about the franchise I've been running for the last 3 or 4 years. It's hugely important to me. I venture to say probably less important to some other people that might have been reading the newspaper this morning. So even small railway stories, or relatively, things that don't have massive impact on passengers, seem to gather disproportionate perspective. Sometimes we don't help ourselves in that regard, and we certainly need to be much smarter and learn how we're going to work with the media. Actually, some of the things you can see here on this slide here have come as a result of the Rail Delivery Group and some of the work they've been doing over the last couple of years to actually make our message a bit clearer. What is it that we are doing as a railway industry actually very well? We are very poor at celebrating our successes, I suggest. But we all know that every year there'll be stories about fares, there'll be stories about fat cats, and what sits behind that, of course, is there is a lack of trust between our customers, perhaps between politicians and the railway industry itself. Is there a lack of trust within the railway industry? Well, quite possibly, because to a degree, when you've been working and investing for a long time in something, maybe you've investing your private capital in something, then when it doesn't happen, whether it be an electrification project, a franchise, or some other scheme, of course that causes a shock to the market. We all know that to create a stable environment, we need continuity and we need visibility and planning. So we have plenty of challenges. Nevertheless, we all know that when rail is in its key market segments, it's unbeatable in terms of the volume of passengers, the amount of freight that it can move, and as Mark explained, it's doing better than ever. So we have seen, in the last 20 years, since privatisation, huge growth in passenger volumes, in punctuality, in satisfaction, in safety, in freight volumes. That's not bad record for an organisation that inevitably still has its challenges. Now, one of the things which fascinates me, and certainly in my railway career, is the degree to which we can optimise the existing railway. Mark spoke earlier very candidly about some of the challenges of investing in and upgrading old infrastructure. One of the challenges I think that's very apparent is our relatively short-term planning horizons. You cannot but marvel at some of what our European colleagues and neighbours have done. Our competitors, mark you, of course, many of these European countries, our competitors for investment in a global world, what they have done with some of their railways and transport systems. It's no contrast that, of course, the high-speed TGV services in France and the RER London services are exactly the same principle as we're developing with HS2 and Crossrail. It's just the same thing by a different name. The key aspects of new capacity, as opposed to continually trying to, frankly, repair old infrastructure, is a very different concept that we have come to grasp too late. But we're there now. I think we've done some things enormously well. When we have taken a whole railway view of our infrastructure and the services we perform, we have transformed railways. Just think about what Chiltern Railways, what C2C, nearby here, what London Overground, what West Coast, what have they all got in common? And the thing I venture they have in common is that unlike many other parts of the network, which have frankly seen a piecemeal or disjointed approach to investment, on those railways, what we've seen over the last 20 years is a significant investment, and it's created a step change, both in terms of the reliability, but also the services that we can offer to passengers. There's no surprise and no coincidence that when we completely modernise the infrastructure and completely modernise the train fleet and then rejuvenate the staff and the retail offer that we're providing, passengers love it and growth comes. It's one of the great things we can look forward to in the Borders Railway. You absolutely know it's going to be a success. The same will be true for Chiltern's Railway, I'm sure. It's a wonderful ability that we have, opportunity that we have in our industry, that when we provide our services well, we're never short of customers. And actually, whilst there's a risk in terms of how many will come, I think really it's about how quickly they will come rather than whether they do or whether they don't. So one of the key areas that we have to focus on much more is how we take a strategic view. Yes, I think it is a 30-year plan. I think it is a plan that sees us looking out in many, through several generations of passengers to identify what we need to do and where. And perhaps our biggest challenge is going to be that, frankly, having left it a bit too long in some cases, perhaps over the last 40 or 50 years, we've actually got a big catch-up programme. And that, I think, is what's creating a lot of the tension that we see and hear today, where, frankly, because everyone wants to improve their railway now, everyone needs to improve their railway now to increase capacity or to increase productivity, there's such a huge amount to be done so quickly, that creates intolerable pressure on the system. And it's some of the pressures that we've been seeing over the last few weeks play out. What I will propose to you shortly is how Railway Supply Group can help fix some of those challenges. Now, I think when we look back through the history of railways, and I think it's important to understand where we've come from, that actually one of the key things that stands out to me is that when the model of railways has changed over the years, it's typically not because of the fact the railway industry has decided itself it wants a different model. Railways have typically changed the environment they live within when the environment they live within has changed, typically as a result of massive economic events. So if we consider sort of the grouping in the 1920s and then when there were over 100 individual railway companies, that was predominantly driven by the First World War, being driven by the rapid development of the motor industry, being driven by the need to consolidate. Late 1948, when we saw nationalisation, yes, a great political speech, a great political dogma, if you like, in terms of moving the railways forward, but necessary because of the Second World War, the state the railways were in, and again, access to capital. Now, what's familiar with where we are today? Thankfully, we haven't had a significant war in Europe, but we've certainly had an economic war, which continues, I think, when we listen to the news about Greece. So the environment we are in now is a very different one, where the capital that's been available to Network Rail, and therefore the industry, over the last 10 years through investing in the regulated asset base is no longer going to be available in the way that it has been previously. So we're going to have to be much more focused on how we manage our capital investments and how we drive the top line of our business in fares rather than just focusing on reducing costs. Because it's a lot easier to grow your revenue than it is to reduce your costs. And as an industry, we don't do and focus enough on that. So the signals are green. The signals are green for our industry, despite some of the big economic challenges we've had. And yet, why is it we've not been able to take full advantage of that environment? A hugely supportive political environment, the most supportive political environment I can remember in my career. And yet, and huge promises of cash, £38 billion. And yet, despite that, frankly, we have not been able to deliver the promises that we've made to the country and to politicians because as an industry, we've not been able to supply, to deliver, to have the capability to implement the projects that we said we were going to do at the price we said we could. So that's a bit embarrassing, really, I think. It's something when we should look upon ourselves as the industry rather than blaming others. The railway has a huge value to the UK economy. And one of the things that drives me is it's not the trains themselves, I don't take numbers anymore, but absolutely what the benefit of running that railway service does. It also drives a huge benefit for UK PLC. And if one of the things that's most valuable, perhaps in a different world from the one we inherited 20 years ago, is the fact that we have had political support from both Treasury, from both Departments of Transport to make some of the investments that we absolutely need. The railway overall, including our supply chain, employs over 200,000 people. That's 70,000 more people than the automotive industry. And it contributes nearly £4 billion a year to the Exchequer. So it is right that we should have an ambitious growth programme for the railway industry, and our role is to work out how we can deliver it. So, you saw briefly a photograph of Sir Roy McNulty, who recently conducted, well, actually 4 years ago, concluded his study into the railway organisation. And one of the things that Sir Roy identified, and I'm paraphrasing clearly because it was a big report, was, of course, that some of the industry incentives were not well aligned. Well, I think we knew that. And we've got a lot further to go to bring some of those incentives together. What we've been doing between South West Trains and Network Rail over the last 3 years has been trying very hard to understand how we can bring some of those incentives together so we can inform future regulatory regimes. But I know this incentive challenge exists right across the supply chain. When we are faced with a stop-start market of investment, whether, yes, we're going to do this and no, we're not, how does that give confidence to organisations, many of which are not large PLCs or limited companies, but might be SMEs that are employing small numbers of people, but with hugely specialist skills? How do we provide confidence to them to invest some of their profits into growth as opposed to taking it in a dividend? How do we convince them that's the right thing to do for a long-term strategy, when frankly our long-term strategy has been patchy? Well, of course, Sir Roy identified that the structure of the industry was one of the things that wasn't helping in that regard. And Rail Delivery Group, simply named, Rail Delivery Group was established now 3 years ago and has been working very much between Network Rail and the TOCs to join up some of the thinking and some of the behaviours between those two organisations. They've had some significant successes, not least some of those slides I showed earlier, in starting to push the positive message about railway. So why Railway Supply Group then? How does another railway group help? Well, fundamentally, you see straight away that in Rail Delivery Group, it's very much about the internal workings of the railway organisation looking out. Railway Supply Group is a very much broader church. Its aim is to involve all of the people that are in the railway supply chain, which includes principally anyone who wants to be counted into that camp, in a way of trying to focus and consolidate what we need to do in the way that we message and work with government to develop our industry. And we're predominantly going to do that through an industrial strategy, which I shall talk about very shortly. You can see many of the really, really complex organisational charts about how the industry works and how money flows around the industry. This is a simplified version, and what we're proposing here, what we're trying to develop here, I suggest, is that actually with transport policy increasingly becoming focused around devolved communities, Manchester, London, and clearly Wales and Scotland stand out. It's enormously important that as a railway industry we don't have one best way of doing everything, because actually we do need to be subtle enough to understand the needs of the different communities with which we work. You might almost see this as the head, the heart and the lungs of the railway, with the oxygen being provided by the operators and the suppliers, but ultimately with our customers sitting firmly there in the middle. So how in that environment do we develop the skills and technology that we need to make sure that we can deliver the environment that we have? The railway supply industry in the UK is an enormously important part of the market. It employs lots of people, as we've talked about, £38 billion worth of project just for Network Rail. On top of that, we've Crossrail 2, we've got HS2, potentially 3, and we've got Transport for London. Mark's already talked about the fact there are 900 people, Network Rail employees, working elsewhere in the world. Well, what is it that we're going to do to grow that supply chain, to grow the investment in skills and education and training, and how are we going to do that in the environment of relatively loose regulation and loose growth? These are the questions that RSG will be answering. And we do need to look worldwide, because these other countries and the trends that we see worldwide is our competition. It's our competition for people, but it's also clearly a competition for investment when companies are choosing to locate where else in the world are they going. And having a good transport network is a hugely important part of that. I'd venture that actually not only do we need to develop a robust railway supply chain for the UK market, but not only because we clearly have a need, but also because I think as Network Rail is starting to identify, there's huge opportunity and growth abroad. Huge opportunity and benefits of being able to export some of the really clever people, some of our really smart technology around the world. And that's good for UK PLC, and again makes it more relevant. So all this comes together in an industrial strategy. Now, some of you may know about industrial strategies. They were developed by the last government, and the principle of them is to align the private sector working in support of and with government. It's not about government specifying how different industries should work or what they should do. It's about creating a forum for discussion and creating a forum for focus and change. There hasn't been an industrial strategy for the railway industry, even though, as we've pointed out, it employs over 200,000 people every year and has huge potential not only to solve some of the problems we have within the country, but also to export abroad. So industrial strategy is being developed with the support of the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills and the Department for Transport, thus the involvement of the two Secretaries of State. The industrial strategy has a 10 to 15-year horizon. Great. That is a really important part we've identified in allowing us to develop a long-term plan. Clearly, we cannot have feast and famine when it comes to employing people, recruiting graduates, trying to make the industry attractive. So we're looking at a 10 to 15-year time horizon to start with. Maybe 30 would be a great place, but 10 to 15 years is a good place to start with. It focuses on all the suppliers, producers, and component parts of the railway industry. The aim of it is to have a consolidated plan to grow the supply chain, both for our UK needs, our internal needs, but also, as I've said, so that we have potential for exports. It takes into account the needs of Network Rail, TOCs and FOX, Transport for London, and other rail-based transport organisations around the UK. Manchester Metrolink stands out there as an organisation that over the last 3 or 4 years has transformed the way that it operates its services and has tripled the size of its network. There's an awful lot of innovation there and skills that we should explore that don't just exist within the traditional parts of the railway industry. But fundamentally, it allows us to focus a discussion with government about what we need to do to better organise ourselves. I don't think we want government to tell us what the answer is, but we have to be better organised and have a discussion with the government about what we need their help to do to allow us to grow. And whether that's the funding model, whether that's the incentive regime, whether that's the way that we develop CP6 and some of the key aspects of that, it's hugely important. I'm told that in the, I believe it's the water industry, that they have as part of their regulatory segment several hundred millions of pounds available for employee retention, recognition and turnover in a way that we just don't recognise in our regulatory plan. They specifically recognise the need to recruit, train and develop people. Doesn't feature explicitly in the railway industry's regulated plan at all, and I think it should. So, your role in all this, because we do need your help, is to get in contact. So the Railway Supply Group can act as the forum, and we have engaged a real rail professional called Jim Lupton, who's going to pull all this together for us, engage with you and clearly and all the key parts of the industry. What I'd ask you to do is to contact the Railway Supply Group. We've got 1 or 2 members here today, and Rupert has made himself known and is known to many of you. I shall be here for the coffee break. And then our website is clearly up there, because if you can contact us, if you'd like to take a part in the development of the industrial strategy, we can send our team to talk to you and engage with you to help us get this right. Because it is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for us to put forward a really compelling argument to government as to how they can help us to help ourselves. So, thank you for listening. I hope that with the themes that we've covered today, you can see a degree of consistency around planning and investment and a focus on people. And I commend to you to enjoy your summer holidays. Thank you.